The Vietnam War, a protracted and devastating conflict, left an indelible mark on the 20th century. It was a war that not only reshaped the geopolitical landscape, but also had profound social and cultural impacts on the countries involved, particularly the United States and Vietnam. Spanning nearly 2 decades, from the early 1950s to 1975, the war was deeply rooted in the complex dynamics of the Cold War and Vietnamese nationalism. The conflict was a manifestation of the global struggle between the communist and capitalist blocs, with Vietnam caught in the crossfire. The Geneva Accords of 1954, following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. This division was meant to be a temporary measure, but it laid the groundwork for future conflict. This division separated the communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, from the US-supported South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The ideological divide between the North and South was stark, with the North advocating for a communist state and the South pushing for a non-communist government. The Accords stipulated nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country. These elections were intended to be a democratic process to determine the future of Vietnam. However, fearing a communist victory, Diem, with US backing, refused to participate in the elections. This refusal was a significant turning point as it undermined the peace process and escalated tensions. This decision ignited tensions and set the stage for a protracted conflict. The South's refusal to hold elections was seen as a betrayal by the North, leading to increased hostilities and the eventual outbreak of war. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, aimed to reunify the country under communist rule. They were determined to achieve this goal through both political and military means. The Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies, sought to prevent the spread of communism. The US involvement was driven by the broader strategy of containment, aimed at stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The stage was set for a long and bloody struggle. The Vietnam War would become one of the most contentious and impactful conflicts of the 20th century, leaving a legacy that continues to be felt to this day. The United States, driven by the domino theory, gradually increased its involvement in Vietnam. This theory was a significant aspect of the Cold War mindset, where the spread of communism was seen as a direct threat to democratic nations. The US government believed that the fall of one Southeast Asian nation to communism would inevitably lead to the fall of its neighbors, creating a domino effect that would destabilize the entire region. The theory posited that if one Southeast Asian nation fell to communism, others would follow. This belief was not just theoretical, it was a driving force behind many of the US foreign policy decisions during this era. The fear of a communist takeover in Southeast Asia was palpable and influenced the actions of US leaders. Initially, US involvement was limited to providing military advisors and financial aid to South Vietnam. These advisors were tasked with training the South Vietnamese military and helping to build a stable government that could resist communist insurgency. Financial aid was also crucial, as it helped to support the South Vietnamese economy and military efforts. However, as the conflict intensified, the US began deploying combat troops in increasing numbers. The situation on the ground became more complex and dangerous, necessitating a stronger military presence. The initial advisory role quickly expanded into active combat operations, with US troops engaging directly with North Vietnamese forces. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, a disputed encounter between US and North Vietnamese naval forces, provided the pretext for a dramatic escalation of US involvement. This incident was portrayed as an unprovoked attack on US ships, leading to a surge in public and political support for increased military action. The US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing President Lyndon B. Johnson to take all necessary measures to protect US interests in Southeast Asia. This resolution effectively gave the president a blank check to escalate US military involvement without a formal declaration of war. This marked a turning point, leading to a rapid increase in US troop deployments and the transformation of the conflict into a full-fledged war. The Vietnam War would go on to become one of the most contentious and impactful conflicts in American history, shaping US foreign policy and domestic politics for years to come. The Vietnam War was characterized by brutal fighting and devastating battles. It was a conflict that pitted the communist forces of North Vietnam and their allies, the Viet Cong, against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war lasted from 1955 to 1975, leaving a profound impact on both the Vietnamese people and the world. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force operating in South Vietnam, employed guerrilla tactics, utilizing the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. They were adept at ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and setting up complex networks of tunnels to move undetected. The US and its allies relied on conventional warfare tactics, air power, and technological superiority. They deployed massive bombing campaigns, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, and used advanced weaponry in an attempt to overpower the enemy. Major battles, such as the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, marked the first major engagement between US forces and the North Vietnamese Army. It was a brutal and intense battle that set the tone for future conflicts. The Battle of Khe Sanh in 1968 was another significant confrontation, with US Marines enduring a 77-day siege by North Vietnamese forces, and the Battle of Hamburger Hill in 1969 resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. This battle was notorious for its grueling combat and the high number of lives lost. The fighting was often characterized by close-quarters combat, booby traps, and relentless artillery bombardments. Soldiers faced constant danger from hidden traps and sudden enemy attacks. The use of Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide by the US military to defoliate the jungle, had devastating long-term environmental and health consequences. The chemical caused severe health issues for both soldiers and civilians, and its effects are still felt today. The Tet Offensive in 1968 marked a turning point in the war. Launched by the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong during the Vietnamese New Year holiday of Tet, the offensive involved coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. Although the offensive was militarily defeated, it had a profound psychological impact. It shattered the perception of US invincibility and eroded public support for the war in the United States. The Tet Offensive exposed the credibility gap between the Johnson administration's optimistic assessments of the war and the reality on the ground. It fueled anti-war sentiment and led to a growing sense of disillusionment with the war effort. By the late 1960s, the United States was facing mounting pressure to extricate itself from the quagmire of the Vietnam War. President Richard Nixon, who had campaigned on a promise to end the war, implemented a policy of Vietnamization. This strategy aimed to gradually withdraw US combat troops while simultaneously strengthening the South Vietnamese armed forces to assume responsibility for their own defense. The process involved providing intensive training, equipment, and financial aid to South Vietnam. However, Vietnamization proved to be a flawed strategy. The South Vietnamese army, plagued by corruption and incompetence, was ill-prepared to effectively combat the North Vietnamese forces. The withdrawal of US troops created a power vacuum that the North Vietnamese were quick to exploit. Despite the efforts to Vietnamese the war, the North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive in 1975. South Vietnamese resistance crumbled and Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to communist forces on April 30th, 1975. The Fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The war had a profound impact on Vietnam and the surrounding region. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers had perished in the conflict, and the country's infrastructure lay in ruins. The war also had a devastating impact on Laos and Cambodia, which were drawn into the conflict. The aftermath of the Vietnam War left a legacy of suffering and instability in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia struggled to rebuild their shattered economies and societies. Millions of people were displaced, and the region faced the challenges of post-war reconciliation and reconstruction. The war also had a lasting impact on US foreign policy. The Vietnam experience led to a period of introspection and a re-evaluation of US global commitments. The war highlighted the limits of US military power and the importance of public support for foreign interventions. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American society, dividing the nation and sparking intense social and political upheaval. The war became increasingly unpopular as the casualty toll mounted and the conflict dragged on. Anti-war protests, fueled by a growing peace movement, spread across college campuses and cities throughout the United States. The war also exposed deep divisions within American society along lines of race, class, and ideology. The disproportionate number of African Americans and working-class Americans serving in Vietnam fueled accusations of inequality and injustice. The Vietnam War continues to cast a long shadow over the United States and the world. It serves as a cautionary tale about the human costs of conflict and the complexities of international relations. The war highlighted the importance of clear objectives, public support, and a realistic assessment of the challenges and consequences of military intervention. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to shape debates about U.S. foreign policy, military strategy, and the use of force in the 21st century. The lessons learned from this tumultuous period serve as a reminder of the importance of diplomacy, understanding, and the pursuit of peace.